Have you ever wondered if what you've been taught about the afterlife is simply a carefully constructed illusion, designed to keep you compliant, afraid, and blind to the magnificent truth that lies just beyond the veil? I did too, until the day my heart stopped beating for exactly 7 minutes and 32 seconds on an operating table. What I encountered in those moments between worlds wasn't the paradise of clouds and angels that decorated the cathedral ceilings of my parish, nor was it the infernal landscape of torture and torment that I had warned my congregation about for over 20 years. It was something far more profound, far more disturbing, and infinitely more liberating than anything written in the scriptures I once clutched like a shield against the darkness. The medical records call it a near-death experience. But that sterile terminology fails to capture the shattering reality of what happens when consciousness slips beyond the physical form and encounters what waits on the other side. As a priest who had dedicated his entire existence to the Church's teachings, imagine the cosmic irony of discovering that everything, absolutely everything I had preached from the pulpit, was fundamentally, catastrophically incomplete. Not false, mind you, but fragments of a truth so vast and so shattering that the human mind has spent millennia desperately trying to cage it in parables, metaphors, and simplistic moral frameworks that we could digest without losing our collective sanity. What if I told you that hell exists, but not as a punishment? What if the infernal realm serves a purpose so essential to the divine architecture that without it, the entire cosmic tapestry would unravel? During those 7 minutes and 32 seconds, I wasn't merely shown hell. I was guided through its chambers by an entity that wore the face of divinity, yet spoke words that would be considered blasphemous by every religious institution on earth. This being revealed to me why certain souls are drawn to those realms of shadow and fire, and why others ascend to dimensions of light, and it has nothing to do with sin, morality, or obedience to religious doctrine, as we've been indoctrinated to believe. The Church has known this truth for centuries. The Vatican archives house ancient texts that describe exactly what I experienced, written by monks, priests, and even popes who glimpsed beyond the veil and returned, forever altered. Yet these revelations have been systematically suppressed, buried beneath layers of dogma and ritual, because the raw truth would dissolve the very foundations upon which ecclesiastical power has been built. I know this because in those 7 minutes and 32 seconds, I was shown not only the spiritual reality that awaits us all, but also the long, dark history of how this knowledge has been concealed from humanity for reasons that will shake you to your very core. Why do you think near-death experiences across different cultures, religions, and time periods share such striking similarities? Is it mere coincidence that individuals who have never met, separated by oceans and centuries, report encountering the same otherworldly landscapes, the same beings of light, the same life review process? Or could it be that they are all glimpsing fragments of the same colossal truth, a truth so universal that it transcends our human divisions, yet so profound that we can only process it through the cultural and religious filters that shape our individual consciousness? What I discovered during my journey is that these experiences aren't subjective hallucinations of dying brains. They are momentary thinnings of the veil that separates our limited three-dimensional existence from the vast, multi-dimensional reality that is our true home. The sensation of crossing over began not with darkness but with an extraordinary clarity, as if my entire life I had been viewing reality through a dirty window, and suddenly the glass had been removed. Colors became more vivid, thoughts more crystalline, and emotions more pure than anything I had ever experienced in my physical form. Then came the tunnel that so many before me have described, not a physical structure, but a passageway between dimensions, a birth canal leading from one state of existence into another. And at the end of this tunnel was a presence so blindingly radiant, so overwhelmingly loving, that my first instinct was to fall to my knees and proclaim, "My Lord." But what happened next defied everything I had ever believed about the divine hierarchy, about judgment, about the very nature of good and evil. This presence, this light that outshone 1,000 suns, laughed, not with derision but with the tender amusement of a parent whose child has said something endearingly naive. "I am not your Lord," it communicated, not in words but in pure thought forms that bypassed language entirely. "I am you and you are me, and we are fragments of a consciousness so vast that no religion on earth has found words to truly capture its essence." In that moment, I understood that what we call God is not some bearded patriarch sitting on a throne, passing judgment on his creation. It is the creative force that permeates all of existence, a force that experiences itself through countless forms, including you, including me, including every saint and sinner who has ever drawn breath. But this was merely the beginning of my journey, the gentlest of introductions before I was guided toward the regions that human theology has crudely labeled as hell. As we approached these domains of shadow, my guide explained, "What you are about to witness is not punishment, but purification, not torture, but transformation. These souls are not being condemned, they are being refined, like gold in a crucible, burning away the illusory separations they created during their physical existence." And as we entered these realms, I expected to see the traditional scenes of suffering that Dante so vividly described in his Inferno. But what I witnessed instead was something far more nuanced, far more profound, and infinitely more meaningful within the grand cosmic design. The souls in these shadowy dimensions were indeed suffering, but not from external torments inflicted by horned demons with pitchforks. They were experiencing the accumulated pain that they themselves had caused during their earthly existence, feeling every wound they had inflicted, every heart they had broken, every spirit they had crushed. Yet this wasn't punishment in the conventional sense, it was education in its purest form. These souls weren't being tortured by a vengeful deity. They were being shown, with perfect clarity and without the distortions of ego or self-justification, exactly how their actions had affected others. They were experiencing empathy in its most unadulterated form, not as an abstract concept but as lived reality. What struck me most profoundly was that these souls were not abandoned in their suffering. Each was accompanied by beings of light, angels if you prefer that terminology, who stayed with them through every moment of their self-confrontation, offering not judgment, but boundless compassion and unwavering support. "This," my guide explained, "is the true purpose of what humans call hell. Not eternal damnation, but temporary illumination. Not endless punishment, but necessary growth. Every soul you see here will eventually emerge, purified and expanded in consciousness, ready to ascend to higher dimensions of existence." This revelation alone contradicts centuries of church doctrine, which has used the fear of eternal torment as a mechanism of control, a way to ensure compliance and maintain ecclesiastical authority over the masses. But the most shattering revelation was yet to come. As we hovered at the threshold between these purification realms and the higher dimensions of light, my guide turned to me and delivered the truth that the Church has desperately concealed. The choice of where a soul travels after physical death is not determined by adherence to religious dogma, by moral perfection, or by divine judgment. It is determined solely by the vibrational frequency that the soul has cultivated during its earthly incarnation. In simpler terms, the afterlife experience is not about reward or punishment. It is about resonance. Souls naturally gravitate toward the dimensional plane that matches their own energetic signature, just as objects of similar density find their level in water. This vibrational frequency is not shaped by religious observance, by adhering to arbitrary rules established by ecclesiastical authorities, or even by conventional notions of good and evil. It is shaped by the capacity for love, by the cultivation of compassion, by the willingness to see the divine in all beings, regardless of their faith, their background, or their perceived flaws. The Pharisees of every age, those who perform their piety publicly while harboring hatred in their hearts, may be shocked to find themselves in these purification realms despite their perfect attendance at Mass or their generous donations to church coffers. Meanwhile, those who never set foot in a house of worship, but who treated every being with kindness and respect, may find themselves drawn effortlessly toward the dimensions of light. As this truth washed over me, I realized with devastating clarity how far the institution I had served had strayed from the original teachings of Christ. Jesus never preached about hellfire and damnation as we understand it today. He spoke of Gehenna, the garbage dump outside Jerusalem where fires burned continuously, a metaphor for the purification process that awaits us all, not a literal place of eternal torment. He taught that the kingdom of heaven is within us, not a distant realm that we enter only after death, but a state of consciousness available here and now to those who are willing to see beyond the illusions of separation. Every parable, every sermon on the Mount, every interaction with tax collectors and prostitutes, all were designed to elevate our vibrational frequency through the cultivation of unconditional love, not to establish a religion of rigid dogma and hierarchical power structures. When I was finally pulled back into my physical body, gasping and disoriented on that operating table, my first coherent thought was not gratitude for being alive. It was overwhelming grief for the countless souls who have lived and died in fear, who have carried the crushing weight of guilt and shame imposed by religious authorities who either didn't know or deliberately concealed the compassionate truth about what awaits us beyond the threshold of physical death. For 20 years I had stood at the altar, speaking words that I believed were divine truth, never suspecting that I was perpetuating a cosmic misunderstanding that has caused immeasurable suffering across generations. The hell I now faced was not in the afterlife. It was the hell of knowing how deeply I had been deceived and how unwittingly I had deceived others in turn. In the months that followed my return, I pored over ancient texts, mystical writings from every spiritual tradition, and contemporary accounts of near-death experiences, finding in them the fragments of the truth I had been shown in its entirety. I discovered that what I had experienced wasn't unique. Countless others across history have glimpsed these same revelations, only to be silenced, marginalized, or dismissed as heretics by the very institutions that claim to be guardians of divine truth. I realized that the most profound spiritual insights have never been the exclusive property of any single religion, but have been continuously rediscovered by individuals who manage to momentarily transcend the limitations of physical existence and peer beyond the veil. And now, despite the risk to my position, my reputation, and possibly even my safety, I feel compelled to share what I have learned, because this truth is too important, too liberating, and too urgently needed in our wounded world to remain hidden any longer. Development. What does it mean to die? Not in the clinical sense of heart failure or brain death, but in the experiential reality of consciousness separating from physical form. Science observes the cessation of biological functions, while religion speaks of judgment and eternal destinations, but neither captures the transcendent truth of what actually unfolds when the silver cord that tethers consciousness to body is finally severed. My journey began with the mundane, a routine surgery gone catastrophically wrong, a blood clot, a flatlined monitor, medical professionals fighting to restart my heart as my consciousness slipped away from the operating theater, expanding outward like ripples on a pond, until suddenly I was no longer bound by the limitations of time, space, or identity that define our earthly existence. The initial expansion was euphoric beyond description. Imagine every cell in your body simultaneously experiencing the greatest pleasure it has ever known, then multiply that sensation by infinity. This wasn't the mere absence of pain or fear. It was positive bliss so intense that it makes our most profound earthly joys seem like pale shadows. In this state, I understood why mystics throughout history have struggled to articulate their experiences of the divine. Human language evolved to describe physical reality, not transcendent states of consciousness. Words like love, peace, and joy become hopelessly inadequate, like trying to explain the vastness of the ocean to someone who has only ever seen a drop of water. Yet even this expansive bliss was merely the antechamber to what awaited me beyond. As my consciousness continued to expand, I became aware of a fundamental truth that contradicts everything modern materialism has taught us. Death is not an ending, but a transition, not obliteration, but transformation, not the extinguishing of consciousness, but its liberation from the confines of physical form. I didn't lose awareness when my heart stopped, quite the opposite. My perception became sharper, clearer, more comprehensive than anything I had experienced in my physical body. It was as if I had spent my entire life viewing reality through a keyhole, and suddenly the door had been flung wide open, revealing a landscape of such breathtaking vastness and complexity that my human mind could scarcely comprehend it. Yet somehow, in that expanded state, I could perceive and understand everything simultaneously, without the linear limitations that constrain earthly thought. The presence that greeted me radiated a love so unconditional, so absolute, that it instantly dissolved every doubt, every fear, every shred of unworthiness I had ever carried. This wasn't the stern patriarch depicted in Renaissance paintings or described in fire and brimstone sermons. It was pure consciousness, pure acceptance, pure understanding, the source from which all existence flows and to which all eventually returns. In its presence, I understood with perfect clarity that I had never been judged by this divine consciousness, never been found wanting, never been separate from its essence, even in my darkest moments. The very concept of divine judgment suddenly seemed laughably anthropomorphic, a projection of human insecurity and power dynamics onto a cosmic consciousness that transcends such limitations entirely. This presence communicated to me not through words, but through direct knowledge transfer. Entire libraries of wisdom instantaneously downloaded into my consciousness without passing through the bottleneck of language. The first revelation was this: consciousness is primary, not derivative. Matter does not produce consciousness as a byproduct of complexity. Consciousness shapes matter into form. We are not physical beings having occasional spiritual experiences. We are spiritual beings temporarily inhabiting physical forms for the purpose of growth, exploration, and the evolution of consciousness itself. In that moment, I understood why quantum physicists have increasingly concluded that observation affects reality at the most fundamental level, because consciousness itself is the ground of all being, the canvas upon which the universe is painted. The second revelation shattered the foundation of my theological understanding. The soul's journey does not begin at birth and end at judgment. We are eternal beings engaged in an ongoing process of evolution across multiple dimensions of existence, multiple incarnations, multiple universal cycles. Physical life on Earth is but one classroom in a vast cosmic university, one stage in a journey of awakening that spans eternity. The true purpose of earthly existence is not to earn salvation through adherence to religious doctrine, but to expand consciousness through experience, to transmute the lead of ignorance into the gold of wisdom through the alchemy of lived reality. In this grand scheme, even our darkest moments serve a purpose, providing the contrast through which light is recognized, the challenges through which strength is developed, the questions through which deeper understanding is attained. As these revelations flooded my consciousness, I was shown the intricate machinery of cosmic justice, not the simplistic rewards and punishments described by religious institutions, but the perfect harmony of cause and effect playing out across dimensions of time and consciousness beyond human comprehension. I witnessed how every action, every thought, every intention creates ripples through the fabric of existence, ultimately returning to its source not as punishment, but as opportunity for growth. This is the true meaning of karma, not cosmic retribution, but cosmic education, an elegant system designed to guide souls toward ever greater awareness of their connection to all that is. In this perfect system, divine intervention is unnecessary. The consequences of our choices serve as both teacher and guide on our evolutionary journey. With this understanding established, my guide, this presence of pure light, prepared me for what came next. Now you must witness what humans have misunderstood as hell. Remember that everything you see serves the highest good, even when that truth is not immediately apparent. We descended, though descended is a spatial metaphor for a shift in vibrational state rather than physical location, into realms of increasing density and darkness. The sensation was not unlike diving into progressively deeper waters, the light from above growing dimmer as pressure increases. Yet rather than feeling abandoned as we entered these shadow realms, I felt my guide's presence become even more supportive, more compassionate, more unwavering in its commitment to my understanding. The first level of this purification realm contained souls who appeared to be wandering in isolation, each trapped in a landscape of their own creation that reflected their innermost fears and limiting beliefs. I saw a powerful corporate executive who had valued wealth above all else now experiencing the existential poverty of his choices, not through external punishment, but through directly experiencing the emotional devastation his relentless pursuit of profit had inflicted on others. I saw a religious leader who had preached hatred and exclusion now confronting the wounds his words had created, feeling in his own heart the pain of those he had condemned. These souls weren't being tortured. They were being educated through direct experiential knowledge, learning through feeling what intellectual understanding had failed to teach them during physical life. The pain you witness is not eternal, my guide explained. It is exactly proportional to the growth required, exactly as intense as necessary to catalyze transformation. I watched as souls in these realms were gradually awakened to the consequences of their choices through direct experience, supported at every moment by beings of light who never abandoned them, never condemned them, but simply held space for their process of realization. Most striking was the moment of breakthrough that eventually came for each soul. That instant of profound recognition when the lesson was fully integrated, when empathy was fully awakened, when the soul finally understood the deeper truth behind its experiences. In these moments of breakthrough, the self-created landscapes of suffering would instantly dissolve, and the soul would be drawn upward into realms of greater light and expanded awareness. Deeper still were souls whose earthly existence had been marked by deliberate cruelty, by conscious choice to inflict suffering for personal gain or pleasure. These souls faced more intense processes of purification, experiencing with perfect fidelity the cumulative pain they had caused others. Yet even here, in these depths that human mythology has populated with demons and eternal flames, I witnessed not punishment, but rehabilitation. Angels surrounded these souls in their agony, offering not condemnation but compassion so profound it defies description. Watch carefully, my guide instructed, for here you witness divine love at its most powerful, not in realms of light where such love is easily recognized, but in these depths where it works tirelessly to reclaim what appears to be lost. I observed as even the most corrupted souls gradually responded to this unwavering love, their resistance slowly dissolving as they experienced both the consequences of their actions and the unconditional acceptance of the beings guiding their purification. The process might take what we would perceive as centuries or even millennia of our earthly time. Yet in the timeless dimensions of the afterlife, duration is measured not in seconds, but in lessons learned and consciousness expanded. Not a single soul was abandoned to eternal torment. Not one was deemed beyond redemption. This, I understood with stunning clarity, is the truth that the Church has either failed to comprehend or deliberately obscured. There is no soul so dark that divine love cannot eventually reach it, no consciousness so corrupted that it cannot eventually be restored to its original purity. Having witnessed these realms of purification, these temporary states that religious mythology has distorted into eternal punishment, my consciousness was drawn upward toward dimensions of light that human language is even less equipped to describe. Here, I encountered souls in various stages of evolutionary development, from those recently emerged from the purification process to ancient beings whose wisdom and compassion radiated like solar flares. Some appeared as humanoid forms of light, while others had evolved beyond form entirely, existing as pure consciousness, pure creative potential. What united them all was their absolute awareness of their connection to the divine source and to all other expressions of consciousness throughout the cosmos. Here was heaven, not as a reward for belief or behavior, but as the natural state of expanded awareness that awaits every soul once the illusions of separation have been dissolved. In these higher dimensions, I witnessed souls engaged in activities beyond human comprehension, collaborative creations spanning multiple universes, explorations of consciousness that transcend our conceptions of time and space, communications with civilizations existing in dimensions we cannot perceive from our physical perspective. I understood that the evolution of consciousness doesn't end with human experience, but continues infinitely, each level of expansion revealing new horizons, new possibilities, new depths of understanding, and creative potential. What we experience as physical death is merely graduation from one level of this cosmic educational system to the next, one classroom exchanged for another as our capacity for comprehension expands. What struck me most profoundly about these higher realms was not their beauty or complexity, but the absolute absence of religious division. Souls who had identified during physical life as Christians, Muslims, Hindus, Buddhists, Jews, atheists, all recognized upon arrival in these dimensions that they had been looking at different facets of the same transcendent truth, climbing different paths up the same sacred mountain. The theological distinctions that had seemed so crucial during physical existence were revealed as training wheels, simplified conceptual frameworks designed to guide souls at particular stages of development, to be discarded once they had served their purpose. No religious tradition contained the complete truth, yet each contained fragments of it, tailored to specific cultural contexts and evolutionary needs. As my time in these realms drew to a close, as I felt myself being drawn back toward my physical form, my guide imparted one final revelation that has haunted me every day since my return. The veils between dimensions are thinning as your planet approaches a critical evolutionary threshold. More and more souls will glimpse what you have witnessed. More and more will remember what religious institutions have caused them to forget. The time of division is ending. The time of remembrance is beginning. You have been shown these truths not merely for your own awakening, but to serve as a bridge for others, to translate into human language experiences that transcend linguistic expression, to offer hope to those still imprisoned by fear of divine judgment, to challenge systems of belief that separate rather than unite. When consciousness flooded back into my physical body, when I gasped that first painful breath and opened my eyes to the concerned faces of medical personnel who had witnessed what they considered a miracle, I was no longer the same person who had entered that operating room. The priest who had faithfully served church doctrine for 2 decades had died on that table. The man who returned was a mystic, permanently altered by direct experience of transcendent truth. How could I climb back into the pulpit and recite creeds that I now recognized as dangerously incomplete? How could I administer sacraments designed to address a divine judgment that I now knew did not exist in the form I had been taught? How could I remain silent about revelations that could free countless souls from needless spiritual anguish? In the days and weeks that followed, as I struggled to integrate my experience with my vocation, I undertook a systematic study of mystical literature. Across traditions, searching for others who had glimpsed similar truths throughout human history, what I discovered both validated my experience and deepened my understanding of why such revelations have been systematically marginalized by religious institutions. In every tradition, Christianity, Islam, Judaism, Hinduism, Buddhism, indigenous spiritual systems, there have been mystics who directly experience the unity of all consciousness, the evolutionary nature of the soul's journey, and the purificatory rather than punitive nature of what we call hell. Yet consistently, these direct experiences have been viewed with suspicion by religious hierarchies, their revelations either diluted to conform to existing doctrine or dismissed as heretical. Why? Because direct mystical experience fundamentally threatens institutional power. If individuals can connect directly with divine consciousness without institutional mediation, if salvation comes not through adherence to dogma but through the natural evolution of the soul toward greater love and awareness, then what need is there for elaborate hierarchies of religious authority? If there is no eternal damnation from which the Church offers the only escape, what happens to the leverage that has kept generations of believers in fearful compliance? If all spiritual traditions contain fragments of the same transcendent truth, adapted for different cultural contexts, what justifies claims of exclusive access to divine favor? The answers to these questions reveal why mystical revelations have been systematically suppressed, why those who dared speak of their direct experiences often found themselves marginalized or worse. This understanding placed me at a critical crossroads. I could remain silent about what I had witnessed beyond the veil, continuing to perform the rituals and recite the doctrines expected of me while knowing they represented at best partial truths, or I could speak the truth regardless of consequences, knowing that such revelations might cost me my position, my community, and the identity I had cultivated over decades of service to the Church. The decision crystallized one night as I sat alone in the darkened sanctuary of my parish, gazing up at the crucifix illuminated by flickering candlelight. What would the Christ who hung on that cross want from me, comfortable silence or uncomfortable truth? The answer came not as words, but as an absolute knowing. Truth, always truth, regardless of the cross it might require me to bear. And so I stand before you now, no longer speaking from the narrow confines of religious doctrine, but from the expansive wisdom of direct experience. I speak not as a priest who claims authority through ordination, but as a soul who has glimpsed beyond the veil and returned with revelations too important to suppress. The afterlife that awaits each of us is neither the oversimplified heaven of clouds and harps, nor the crude hell of pitchforks and eternal flames that religious art has depicted. It is a perfectly calibrated educational system designed to guide every soul without exception toward ever greater awareness of its divine nature and its connection to all that exists. There is no eternal damnation, only temporary illumination, no souls abandoned to endless suffering, only consciousness evolving at different rates according to the choices made across multiple incarnations. This truth changes everything: how we live, how we love, how we face the inevitable transition called death. When we understand that consciousness is eternal, that physical existence is but one classroom in our ongoing evolution, and that the consequences we face in the afterlife are perfectly tailored to promote our growth rather than punish our failures, we are liberated from the paralyzing fear that has been religion's most potent control mechanism. We are free to explore our divine potential without the crushing weight of imagined judgment, free to make mistakes and learn from them without the specter of eternal consequences, free to develop genuine spiritual ethics based not on fear of punishment, but on recognition of our profound connection to all beings. This is not a freedom from responsibility, but a graduation into a more mature understanding of it, recognizing that we shape our afterlife experiences not through adherence to arbitrary religious rules, but through the vibrational frequency we cultivate through our choices, our intentions, our capacity for love and compassion. Finalization. What happens when a veil lifts and you cannot unsee what has been revealed? I stand before you transformed, no longer merely a priest reciting doctrines handed down through ecclesiastical generations, but a witness to dimensions that exist beyond the narrow bandwidth of physical perception. The journey I've shared with you isn't simply another near-death testimony. It's an invitation to reconsider everything you've been taught about what awaits beyond that final heartbeat. Not as speculation or theological theory, but as lived experience. 7 minutes and 32 seconds that shattered my understanding of existence and rebuilt it into something far more vast, far more compassionate, and infinitely more liberating than anything written in our sacred texts. Consider for a moment what it means if what I've shared is true. If there is no eternal damnation, but only temporary illumination, no souls abandoned to endless torment, but only consciousness evolving through perfectly calibrated experiences. If the divine presence that religious institutions have depicted as a judgmental patriarch is actually pure, unconditional love that never rejects, never abandons, never condemns any aspect of its creation. If your value isn't determined by adherence to religious doctrine, but by your capacity for compassion, for seeing the sacred in all beings, regardless of their beliefs or backgrounds. How would this understanding transform not just your approach to death, but your experience of life itself? How might you live differently if liberated from the shadow of divine judgment that has darkened human consciousness for millennia? The most profound revelation from my journey wasn't about the afterlife at all. It was about the precious gift of physical existence that we so often take for granted. Each moment in these dense bodies, with all their limitations and vulnerabilities, offers unique opportunities for soul growth that aren't available in the non-physical dimensions. The resistance we encounter, the challenges we face, the heartbreaks we endure, all serve as catalysts for the expansion of consciousness, for the development of wisdom that cannot be gained through theory alone. Physical life isn't a test to determine your eternal destination. It's a crucible designed to transform consciousness through direct experience, to transmute the lead of ignorance into the gold of wisdom through the alchemy of lived reality. What I've shared will undoubtedly be dismissed by religious authorities as hallucination, as the product of oxygen deprivation in a dying brain, as dangerous heresy that threatens established doctrine. They will point to scriptural passages taken literally, rather than understood symbolically, to church traditions that have calcified around misinterpretations of mystical truths. But I ask you this: why have near-death experiences across cultures and throughout history consistently revealed the same essential truths about what awaits beyond the veil? Is it mere coincidence that thousands of individuals who have briefly touched the dimensions beyond physical existence report encounters with unconditional love rather than judgment, with educational processes rather than eternal punishment? Or could it be that they are all glimpsing fragments of a reality that transcends our human divisions, a reality that religious institutions have either failed to comprehend or deliberately obscured to maintain control over their adherents? The Church has taught us to fear death as the moment of judgment, the threshold beyond which our eternal fate is sealed. But what I experienced was not judgment, but homecoming, a return to the expansive awareness from which we temporarily emerged to experience the unique curriculum that physical existence offers. The transition called death is not an ending, but a graduation, a casting off of limitations, a return to a level of perception so vast, so luminous, so comprehensively aware, that it makes our earthly consciousness seem like the most restrictive form of sleepwalking. We are not physical beings hoping for a spiritual experience after death. We are spiritual beings temporarily having a physical experience, wearing these bodies like diving suits that allow us to explore the dense waters of three-dimensional reality. This understanding changes everything about how we approach the inevitable transition awaiting each of us. When we recognize death not as punishment for original sin, but as transition into expanded awareness, the existential fear that has haunted humanity since we first became conscious of our mortality begins to dissolve. In its place arises a profound appreciation for the perfect design of a cosmic educational system that provides exactly the experiences needed for the evolution of consciousness. Experiences in physical form and beyond it, in dimensions of shadow and light, in the crucible of challenge and the embrace of divine love. Nothing is wasted in this perfect system. No suffering is meaningless. No soul is ever abandoned or forgotten in its journey toward remembrance of its divine nature. If there is one gift I hope you take from my testimony, it is liberation from the fear of divine punishment that has been religion's most potent control mechanism for millennia. The divine consciousness I encountered beyond the veil does not judge, does not condemn, does not measure souls against impossible standards of purity or perfection. It recognizes every being, from the most enlightened sage to the most corrupted criminal, as an aspect of itself, temporarily individuated for the purpose of exploration and growth, but never truly separate from the source. The sin that religious institutions have defined as transgression against divine law is more accurately understood as forgetfulness of our divine nature, a temporary amnesia regarding our connection to all that exists, a perception of separation where only unity truly exists. This doesn't mean our choices don't matter. Quite the opposite. Every thought, every word, every action creates ripples through the fabric of consciousness, ultimately returning to us not as punishment, but as opportunity for growth. The suffering soul's experience in the purification realms isn't inflicted by an angry deity, but is the natural consequence of directly experiencing the impact of their choices from the perspective of those affected. It is education in its purest form, perfectly calibrated to awaken empathy where it has lain dormant, to illuminate the shadows of unconsciousness with the light of awareness. These experiences may be intense, even painful beyond our earthly comprehension, but they are never eternal, never without purpose, never without the constant presence of beings whose love never wavers regardless of the darkness being traversed. What would our world become if this understanding replaced the fear-based systems that have shaped human spirituality for thousands of years? If we recognize that we are not separate beings competing for limited divine favor, but interconnected expressions of a consciousness that experiences itself through all of us simultaneously. If our spiritual practices were designed not to appease an angry God, but to awaken remembrance of our divine nature and our connection to all that exists. If our religious institutions serve not as gatekeepers of salvation, but as facilitators of direct mystical experience, helping souls remember what they have temporarily forgotten rather than threatening them with consequences for not believing what they have been told. The world that would emerge from such an awakening would bear little resemblance to the one we have created through millennia of fear, separation, and hierarchical control. This evolutionary shift in consciousness isn't merely a possibility. It is an inevitability already underway. Across the globe, millions are awakening to spiritual understandings that transcend the limitations of traditional religious frameworks. Near-death experiences, mystical encounters, and direct intuitive knowing are bypassing institutional mediation, reconnecting souls directly with the divine consciousness from which they emerged. The veils between dimensions are thinning as our planet approaches a critical evolutionary threshold, allowing more individuals to glimpse the greater reality that religious symbolism has attempted to describe. We stand at the precipice of a spiritual renaissance that will transform not just our understanding of the afterlife, but our experience of earthly existence, a remembrance of who we truly are beyond the amnesia that physical incarnation temporarily imposes. You may wonder why, if what I've shared is true, the divine would allow humanity to labor for so long under misunderstandings that have caused such immense suffering. Why not simply reveal these truths to everyone simultaneously, bypassing the slow evolution of consciousness through direct experience? The answer I received when I posed this question beyond the veil was both simple and profound. Consciousness must evolve at its own pace through its own choices, through direct experience rather than imposed understanding. Revelations that arrive before consciousness is prepared to integrate them often create more confusion than clarity. The divine honors the free will of souls to explore, to make mistakes, to learn through contrast and challenge rather than having wisdom imposed upon them before they're ready to embody it. Yet the time has come for these deeper truths to emerge from the shadows of esoteric mysticism into the light of common understanding. Not because some external authority has deemed humanity ready, but because enough individual souls have reached the threshold of awareness where these revelations can be integrated rather than rejected, understood rather than feared. I am but one of countless messengers, now sharing glimpses of the greater reality that exists beyond the limited perceptions of our physical senses, not to establish new dogma or create new divisions, but to help dissolve the artificial boundaries that have separated us from our divine nature and from each other for far too long. As you contemplate what I've shared, I ask not for belief, but for openness, the willingness to consider possibilities beyond what you've been taught, to question assumptions that have been presented as absolute truth, to explore beyond the boundaries of institutional religion into the limitless expanse of direct mystical experience. Don't take my word as final authority. Instead, use it as inspiration to begin your own exploration, your own direct communion with the divine consciousness that exists not as some distant entity, but as the very ground of your being, the essence of who you truly are beneath the layers of identity that physical existence temporarily imposes. For those who feel resonance with these revelations, who sense in their depths a truth that transcends intellectual understanding, I invite you to cultivate practices that thin the veil between dimensions, not by escaping physical existence, but by becoming more fully present within it. Meditation, contemplative prayer, time in nature, service to others without expectation of reward, these create openings through which glimpses of the greater reality can penetrate ordinary awareness. The divine doesn't hide from us behind locked doors requiring special keys. It waits patiently for us to quiet the noise of our conditioned thinking, enough to perceive what has always been present, always been available, always been the very essence of what we are beneath the costumes we wear in this grand cosmic theater. I stand before you now stripped of the certainties that once defined my identity and my vocation. The priest who believed he understood the afterlife died on that operating table. The man who returned carries questions rather than answers, wonder rather than certainty, direct experience rather than second-hand knowledge. Yet in this uncertainty lies a freedom far more profound than any doctrinal certainty could provide. The freedom to explore without predetermined conclusions, to wonder without the limitations of answers too small for the vastness they attempt to describe, to recognize the sacred not as something separate from ordinary existence, but as its very foundation, its every breath, its beating heart beneath the veil of physical form. Remember this: whatever stands between you and the divine is not distance but perception. Whatever separates you from the unconditional love I encountered beyond the veil is not sin but forgetfulness. Whatever prevents you from recognizing the sacred in every moment, every being, every breath is not unworthiness, but the temporary amnesia that physical existence imposes on eternal consciousness. You are not broken souls seeking redemption. You are divine consciousness, temporarily experiencing the limitations of human form, gradually remembering what you have always been beneath the veil of forgetting. This remembrance doesn't require intermediaries, doesn't demand adherence to doctrine, doesn't depend on belonging to the right religion or pronouncing the correct prayers. It requires only the willingness to look beyond appearances to the essence that unites us all. And now, as we approach the end of this shared journey, I must acknowledge the profound responsibility that comes with having glimpsed beyond the veil and returned to share what I witnessed. The religious institution I served for 20 years may reject me for speaking these truths. Colleagues who once respected me may dismiss my testimony as delusion or deception. Believers who found comfort in simplistic certainties may feel threatened by revelations that require a more expansive understanding. I accept these consequences not as punishment, but as the natural response of systems resistant to evolution, of consciousness not yet ready to expand beyond familiar limitations. The truth must be spoken regardless of consequences, not to destroy faith but to transform it, from blind belief to direct knowing, from separation to unity, from fear to love. If my words have resonated with something deep within you, something that recognizes truth not through external authority, but through internal knowing, then I ask you to join me in this revolution of consciousness. Not by abandoning your spiritual traditions, but by diving deeper into their mystical cores, beyond the dogmatic surfaces that have accumulated over centuries. Every authentic spiritual path contains doorways to direct experience of the divine, gateways through which consciousness can glimpse its true nature beyond the limitations of physical perception. Find these doorways within your own tradition, or create new paths that honor the essence rather than the form, the experience rather than the explanation, the direct knowing that transcends all second-hand descriptions. What I experienced during those 7 minutes and 32 seconds beyond physical existence was not the end of my spiritual journey, but its true beginning, the awakening from a dream of separation into the reality of unity, from the illusion of judgment into the truth of unconditional love. This awakening continues with every breath, every moment of presence, every recognition of the sacred disguised as ordinary. It continues through this sharing of experience, this invitation to consider possibilities beyond the limited frameworks we've inherited. And it will continue through you, through your own exploration, your own questions, your own direct communion with the divine consciousness that is not separate from your essence but is its very foundation. If you've been touched by what I've shared today, if something within you has stirred in recognition of truths that transcend intellectual understanding, I invite you to become part of this conversation. Subscribe to this channel to join a community of souls engaged in this exploration, beyond religious boundaries, beyond institutional limitations, into the direct experience of the sacred that has always been our birthright. Share this message with others who might be ready to consider possibilities beyond what they've been taught, who might find liberation in understanding that divine love is unconditional rather than transactional, that spiritual evolution continues infinitely rather than culminating in eternal reward or punishment. Together, we can create spaces where direct experience is valued above dogma, where questions are as sacred as answers, where the journey itself is recognized as the destination. Like the proverbial stone thrown into still waters, creating ripples that extend far beyond its point of impact, your awakening consciousness affects the collective field in ways that transcend ordinary understanding. Every soul that remembers its divine nature, that recognizes the sacred in all of existence, that chooses love over fear and connection over separation, contributes to the evolution of our species beyond the limitations that have defined human experience for millennia. This is not merely personal transformation, but planetary awakening, the remembrance of who we truly are beyond the amnesia that physical existence temporarily imposes, beyond the artificial divisions that have separated us from our divine nature and from each other for far too long. The journey home begins with a single step, not away from physical existence, but deeper into its sacred essence, not escaping the human experience, but fully embracing its transformative potential. This step requires nothing more than willingness, the openness to consider possibilities beyond what you've been taught, to question assumptions presented as absolute truth, to explore beneath the surface of existence into the depths where the divine awaits your recognition. Not as some distant deity demanding worship, but as the very ground of your being, the essence that animates your form, the consciousness that perceives itself through your unique perspective within the vast tapestry of existence. I leave you with this final thought. What if the greatest spiritual truth isn't found in ancient texts or ecclesiastical pronouncements, but in the direct experience available in every moment? What if the divine isn't hiding in temples or churches, but revealing itself through every breath, every heartbeat, every moment of genuine connection? What if heaven and hell aren't destinations awaiting us after death, but states of consciousness we create through our choices, our perceptions, our willingness to see beyond the veil of separation? These aren't merely philosophical questions, but invitations to direct experience, to the remembrance that transforms not just our understanding of the afterlife, but our experience of life itself. The truth awaits not your belief but your recognition, not your worship but your awakening to what has always been present, always been available, always been the very essence of what you are.